Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a French seam. That's the type of seam that's shown here, where on the inside you get a really lovely self-enclosed seam allowance without any fraying edges, and on the right side a nice smooth flat seam. This technique works really well on sheer fabrics, things such as organza, chiffon, georgette, or really fine fabrics. I'm going to make a sample of the French seam, and I've cut myself two pieces of fabric which are approximately 20 centimetres or 8 inches long by about 8 centimetres or 3 inches wide. Start first by placing the two pieces of fabric with the wrong sides together. This is a bit unusual when you make seams because usually you'd be placing the right sides together, but we start with the wrong sides. I'm going to be using a total seam allowance of 15 millimetres or 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch, but I begin with making a seam of just 1 centimetre. So I'm going to stitch along this edge here using a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm then going to press the seam, trim it, and then stitch the seam again with the right sides together, stitching this time just 0.5 centimetre so that I've used all of my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Wrong sides together. You can pin those in place if you want to, and then we'll stitch 1 centimetre along that edge. I'm going to follow the 1 centimetre line on the needle plate. Begin with back tacking and then stitch to the end. And back tack at the end. Next, I can trim off any threads. And then open up the seam and press the seam allowance to one side, pulling it flat to make sure that it sits flat from the other side. And then check it is sitting flat from the other side. Next, I'm going to trim this seam allowance to about 3 millimetres. And now that that seam allowance is really short, I'm going to open up the fabric and fold it with the right sides together and just roll that edge so that the original seam sits along the folded edge. You can put some pins in at this stage, particularly if you're using a fabric that's a bit slippy. I want to make sure that that seam sits right on the edge, and the pressing part will help with this stage, so it is important to do the pressing. Just roll it out, make sure the seam's right on the edge. And then I'm going to stitch again 0.5 centimetre from this seam. If you don't have a marking on your needle plate to indicate where the 0.5 centimetre is, you could use some masking tape to create your own marker. And now keep the edge of the fabric here in line with your masking tape line. Start with back tacking. And then stitch all the way to the end. the end, back tack again. I can trim my threads again. And then I want to first of all press the seam flat, embedding those stitches. And then open up the seam and press the enclosed seam allowance to one side. Again, pulling the fabric flat as you press. And then turn that over and just check the seam is flat from the right side. Got a lovely flat finish on the right side, and on the wrong side a nice self-enclosed seam allowance without any fraying edges.